split of the Mongol Empire in 1259 eventually brought about its collapse. The Ilkhanate lasted 100 years, being overrun in 1357. The Great Khanate became the Yuan dynasty in China, which lasted until 1368. The Golden Horde lingered on until 1502, and while the Chagatai Khanate lasted in some places until 1847, large parts of it began collapsing in the 14th century. All in all, the Mongol Empire was as short-lived as it was massive, really only lasting around 160 years. Despite its short span, the Mongol Empire would have huge consequences, some of which can still be felt today. One of the major positive effects of the Mongol expansion was the stability that it brought. Genghis Khan's harsh legal system, or yasa, was feared and discouraged crimes like robbery, murder, and kidnapping. A woman with a golden vessel on her head might walk alone without fear or dread. The stability and safety allowed people to trade goods and eventually led to the reopening of the Silk Road, which was an ancient trade network that connected Europe to Asia. The Silk Road got its name from, you guessed it, silk, which was produced in China and, with the help of merchants and their caravans, made its way west to wealthy buyers in Europe. But silk wasn't the only thing that made its way along the Silk Road. Spices, silver, gold, ivory, furs, and even carrots were just some of the valuable goods traded in all directions. Most importantly, the Silk Road helped technology to travel from the east to the west. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was backward compared to China and the Middle East. The Silk Road allowed the West to get Chinese and Middle Eastern technologies, which changed Europe and the world. The Chinese invented paper and printing, which, once Europeans got it, led to books, pamphlets, and newspapers. They were a major factor in the Reformation, which we'll make a series on in the future. Arabic cultures developed the compass, which allowed much better navigation. Add this to a few other inventions, and humans became capable of long-range navigation, leading to European colonization of the Americas and Asia. The Mongols had often used a Chinese invention as a weapon in battles and sieges: gunpowder. The Silk Road allowed Europeans to get their hands on gunpowder, and this would change both how Europeans fought wars and also how their societies were structured. Swords and armour, you see, required skill and money to use, which meant you needed rich people who could practice fighting, or, as Europe knew them, knights. Gunpowder meant anyone could fight, and knights became less useful, which led to a changed relationship between the peasants and those at the top of society. It wasn't just technology that travelled along the Silk Road, it was also ideas. The Mongols proved that they were willing to take on new ideas, and this allowed them to conquer anything in their path. When Europe started taking on the same attitude, they also gained. The Mongols organised themselves into groups of 10, which was adopted by Europe. A few developments later, and we have the decimal system, on which I'm sure a maths teacher can tell you more. Arabic numbers, which are actually from India, came to Europe via the Silk Road. They replaced Roman numerals, which didn't even have a number 0. Once again, if your maths teacher isn't a fan of the Mongols and the Silk Road, then politely request that they conduct all lessons in Roman numerals and without zeros or decimals. The idea of a relay postal system also came via the Mongols, which led to even more ideas being spread quicker. Ideas in philosophy and science came via the Silk Road and would be developed to the point where Europe was more advanced scientifically than the places these ideas came from. The military strategies of the Mongols also reached Europe, changing the way armies would fight forever. The German military studied the Mongols and used Mongol principles in World War II, and many of these ideas are still studied and used today. Lastly, and this is no small thing, the Mongol expansion, the Silk Road, and the increased contact between cultures made the world just a little bit smaller. This trend has continued. We now call it globalization. The increased contact between East and West meant the spread of advanced technology and good ideas, but negative things can also spread by the same method. In the 14th century, a deadly pandemic spread through Eurasia. It was a virus called Yersinia pestis. Found in rats and transmitted to humans by fleas, it would become the deadliest plague in human history. It was known in Europe as the Black Death. This pandemic was also known as the bubonic plague, taking its name from the buboes that it caused, or growths that oozed blood and pus. It first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumours in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple. This deadly bubo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere. The buboes and spots were signs that death would soon take the victim, and it's important to note that while this disease was disgusting and horrific in biological terms, it also took an emotional toll. Try and imagine how our society would respond to a pandemic like the Black Death. The earliest record of the bubonic plague can be found in Yuan dynasty China in 1334. It spread through the Mongol and Chinese lands, probably killing half the population. In some provinces, it killed 90% of the population. In the 1340s, it spread through Central Asia and the Middle East, devastating everything and everyone in its path. In 1347, it reached Russia, where the Golden Horde was besieging Kafar on the Black Sea. The whole army was affected by a disease which killed thousands upon thousands every day. The Mongol leader ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in hopes that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. Some people escaped Kafar in ships that landed in Constantinople and Italy. From these cities, the plague spread like wildfire. The mortality in Siena began in May. It was a cruel and horrible thing. It seemed that almost everyone became stupefied seeing the pain. It's impossible for the human tongue to recount the awful truth. Indeed, one who did not see such horribleness can be called blessed. The victims died almost immediately. They would swell beneath the armpits and in the groin and fall over while talking. Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. For this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. And so they died. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priests, without divine officers. In many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in these ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as these ditches were filled, more were dug. I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Within 2 years, a third of the population of Europe would die. Within 4 years, half of all Europe was dead. The plague would kill 70% of England and up to 80% of Italy, France and Spain. The short-term consequences of the plague were obvious and horrific. Worldwide, up to 200 million people died. The longer-term results are more mixed and in many ways much more consequential. The population of Europe dropped sharply and there were so few workers that farms were abandoned. The remaining peasants had much more power than they'd ever had before. In order for the feudal lords to grow crops, they had to pay the peasants more. If they didn't, the peasants would simply go somewhere else or riot. As a result, the feudal system of knights, lords and peasants began to break down. The lack of workers encouraged merchants to find and provide slaves who they kidnapped from Africa, creating a new slave trade. The high cost of workers encouraged inventions that required fewer workers. This would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. All of these changes have of course been simplified and were in reality spread out over hundreds of years. But much can be traced back to the short-lived Mongol Empire and the conditions they created through their rapid, brutal, and impressive expansion under a nomad named Genghis Khan. When did the Mongol Empire start and finish? What did Europe gain via the Silk Road? How did the Black Death transmit to humans? What was a short-term consequence of the Black Death? What were some long-term consequences? Did the Mongol expansion have an effect on our modern world? Why?